You think you understand magnets because you've seen them stick to a fridge or maybe pull a paper clip across a table. It looks simple, almost harmless, something you stop noticing after childhood. But what if that simple object is actually revealing one of the deepest secrets of reality itself? Because right now, around you, there are invisible structures stretching through space. They have no color, no sound, no texture. You cannot touch them, and yet they are constantly shaping what matter does, where it moves, and how it behaves. And the strange part is this: you are not outside of them, you are inside them. Right now, a magnet is not just pulling things. It is changing the geometry of space around it. It is writing directions into emptiness. It is turning nothingness into something that can guide motion without ever making contact. And once you start thinking about that properly, the world you thought was solid and predictable begins to feel very different. Because if forces can exist without touch, if influence can spread through empty space, then what else have we misunderstood about reality just because we trusted our eyes too much? This is where things start to get interesting. Not the surface level explanation of north and south poles, but the deeper idea that the universe is not built from objects alone. It is built from fields, hidden patterns that fill every corner of space, quietly deciding how everything moves long before anything physically collides. And magnets are just the first doorway into that world. Because once you see what is really happening around a simple piece of metal, you stop thinking about things pushing things. You start thinking about space itself as something active, something structured, something that behaves like an invisible intelligence written into the fabric of reality. So the real question is not how magnets stick to your fridge. The real question is, what kind of universe allows invisible forces to shape everything you touch without ever being seen at all? When people hear the word magnet, they usually imagine a simple object stuck on a fridge, holding paper in place like it is doing something ordinary. But that is only the surface appearance of something far deeper and far stranger. A magnet is not just a piece of material. It is a visible clue that the universe is filled with invisible structures that stretch through space, shaping how matter behaves without ever needing to be seen. If you try to truly understand what is happening around a magnet, you begin to step into a world where the idea of touch becomes less important than the idea of fields, and where forces are not pushes and pulls between objects, but rather patterns written into space itself. A magnetic field is one of those ideas that seems simple at first, but becomes more mysterious the longer you think about it. It is invisible, and yet it is not imaginary. If you place iron filings around a magnet, they align themselves into curves and arcs that reveal something structured, almost like invisible wind lines made visible by dust. That pattern is not drawn by human hands, it is created by the magnet itself. The space around the magnet is not empty in the ordinary sense. It is filled with influence. Every point around it has a direction and a strength, as if space itself has become organized into a map of forces. This is why we say a magnetic field exists, even though we cannot see it directly. We only see what it does. Now, the deeper question is where this field comes from. It does not come from the magnet as a solid object in the way most people imagine. If you zoom into the magnet, far beyond what eyes can see, you find atoms, and inside those atoms are electrons constantly moving. Those electrons are not just particles sitting still. They have motion, spin, and quantum behavior that produces tiny magnetic effects. When many of these atomic magnetic moments line up in the same direction, the result is a large-scale magnetic field that extends outside the material. So what we call a magnet is really a coordinated dance of electrons that have synchronized their invisible behavior into something large enough to affect the world around it. This leads to a surprising realization. Magnetism is not something added to matter. It is something matter is already doing. Every electron carries a magnetic property, and every atom contains motion that can contribute to magnetic effects. In most materials, these tiny magnetic influences cancel each other out because they are randomly oriented. But in certain materials, under certain conditions, they align. When that happens, the invisible becomes organized, and the result is a field that stretches into space like an invisible architecture. What makes this even more fascinating is that magnetic fields do not require contact to exert influence. In everyday life, we are used to forces that depend on touch or direct interaction. If you push a door, your hand touches it. If you lift a cup, you grip it. But magnetism breaks that expectation. A magnet can pull a piece of metal without ever touching it. That seems almost like magic until you accept the idea that space itself is part of the interaction. The field between the magnet and the metal is not empty. It is active. It carries information about direction and strength. The metal responds not to the magnet itself, but to the field that fills the space between them. This idea becomes even more interesting when you realize that everything around you is sitting inside multiple invisible fields at once. You are not just in a room, you are inside Earth's magnetic field, which stretches far into space. The planet itself behaves like a giant magnet with a north and south pole. The core of the Earth, made of molten iron and nickel, is constantly moving, generating currents that produce this planetary magnetic field. Without it, life would be exposed to intense solar radiation. So, in a very real sense, this invisible structure is not just a curiosity of physics, it is part of what makes life possible on the surface of the planet. When you think about Earth as a magnet, it changes how you understand direction. A compass does not know north in a human sense. It simply aligns itself with the magnetic field lines of the Earth. The needle is responding to invisible structure in space, much like iron filings respond to a bar magnet. What seems like a simple navigation tool is actually a demonstration that the entire planet is wrapped in a field that can guide motion without any visible force pushing things around. Now consider something even more subtle, the fact that you are also part of this system. Your body is made of atoms, and those atoms contain electrons, and those electrons behave according to electromagnetic laws. That means you are not separate from these fields. You are built out of the same ingredients that produce them. However, the magnetic effects inside your body are usually balanced out, so you do not behave like a magnet in the way a fridge magnet does. Still, on a microscopic level, your existence is inseparable from the same physics that governs magnets, stars, and planets. This brings us to a deeper realization about what a force field actually means. In popular imagination, force fields are often thought of as glowing barriers or energy shields. But in physics, a field is not a barrier at all. It is a description of how something behaves across space. A magnetic field tells you, at every point in space, how a magnetic object would respond if placed there. It is not a wall, it is a map of influence. So when science fiction talks about force fields, it is not completely wrong in spirit. The concept already exists in reality, but it is more subtle and more mathematically structured than visual imagination usually allows. The important shift in understanding is that fields are not secondary effects, they are fundamental. Objects do not simply push and pull each other directly across empty space. Instead, they modify the fields around them, and those fields then influence other objects. This means interaction is always mediated by space itself. Space is not nothing, it is an active participant in physical reality. This is one of the most important ideas in modern physics, and magnetism is one of the clearest examples where it becomes visible through indirect observation. If you take this further, you start to realize that magnetism is part of a larger family of forces called electromagnetism. Electricity and magnetism are not separate phenomena, they are different aspects of the same underlying structure. Moving electric charges create magnetic fields, and changing magnetic fields create electric currents. This interdependence means that what we call magnetism is really part of a dynamic relationship where motion and field continuously generate each other. The universe is not static in its forces, it is constantly self-updating. Even light itself is connected to this story. Light is an electromagnetic wave, meaning it is a ripple in electric and magnetic fields traveling through space. So when you look around you, everything you see is ultimately interacting with electromagnetic fields in some form. The colors, the textures, the reflections. All of it is dependent on the same fundamental structure that produces magnetism. In that sense, a magnet is not a special object. It is a small, concentrated expression of a universal principle. What becomes especially striking is how invisible this entire framework is in everyday experience. You can live your entire life without ever directly seeing a magnetic field, and yet it is constantly present, shaping technology, guiding navigation systems, enabling motors, storing data, and even influencing particles in space. The invisibility of it does not reduce its importance. In fact, it highlights a key idea in physics. Reality is not limited to what can be seen. Much of what governs the behavior of the world exists beneath sensory perception. When you start to think in terms of fields rather than objects, your intuition about reality begins to shift. Instead of imagining the world as separate things interacting by contact, you start to see it as overlapping regions of influence. A magnet is not just an object, it is a disturbance in space that extends outward. Another object entering that space is not being touched in the traditional sense. It is responding to the structure already present there. This is a subtle but profound change in perspective. Even the idea of distance becomes less rigid. If a field extends infinitely, then the influence of a magnet technically never fully disappears. It only weakens with distance. That means interaction is not simply on or off. It is graded, continuous, and distributed. The universe is less like a collection of billiard balls and more like a vast interconnected fabric where every point has meaning and direction encoded into it. And as this understanding deepens, it becomes clear that what we casually call invisible force fields around everything you touch is not science fiction exaggeration, but some simplified way of describing a much richer reality. Every interaction you experience, even the simplest ones involving metal, electricity, or direction, is part of a larger invisible structure that is always present, always active, and always shaping what happens. Next, when you step back from everything we've explored, one idea starts to rise above all the details. The world is far less solid and simple than it appears. What we casually call empty space is not empty at all. It is structured, organized, and alive with invisible rules that quietly guide how matter behaves. A magnet is not just an object doing something special. It is a window into that hidden structure where influence spreads without touch and where direction exists without visible lines. What feels like a simple pull between metal and magnet is actually space itself, speaking in a language we cannot see but can measure. Fields are not decorations added onto reality. They are the framework through which reality operates. And once you accept that, even slightly, your understanding of distance, contact, and force begins to change. Things are no longer isolated objects bumping into each other randomly. They are part of a continuous system where everything is connected through invisible layers of influence. This is the deeper message hidden inside magnetism. The universe is not silent and it is not empty. It is structured in ways that do not depend on human senses to exist. Every compass needle pointing north, every motor spinning, every invisible line of force stretching through space is a reminder that reality is operating on principles far deeper than what we see on the surface. And maybe that is the most important shift of all. Not just understanding magnets, but realizing that what we see is only a small part of what is actually there. The real universe is always richer, stranger, and more interconnected than it first appears. Good luck for your journey of learning and curiosity, and thank you for staying till the end of this exploration.